June 2, 1953. Outside Westminster Abbey, in the organized chaos of coronation preparations, Princess Margaret steps toward a tall man in Royal Air Force uniform and reaches up to brush a small piece of lint from his chest. The gesture takes 2 seconds. A journalist registers it. That journalist files with a foreign press agency. Within days, American and Continental papers run the story. Within weeks, the Sunday People is printing it in Britain, framed as rumor, unmistakably real. Within months, what began as a 2-second gesture will have consumed the next 2 years of Margaret's life, tested every institution in the kingdom, and ended in a decision that this channel has covered only in passing, and that this story requires you to understand completely before judging what came after. The man whose uniform she was straightening was Group Captain Peter Townsend. And before we talk about what the institution did to him and to her, you need to understand exactly who he was. Because the version of this story that gets told most often, the romantic tragedy of a princess and her forbidden love, does him almost no justice. Peter Wooldridge Townsend was born in Rangoon, Burma, on November 22, 1914, one of 6 children of a British Army colonel. He joined the Royal Air Force in 1933, trained at Cranwell, and by the outbreak of the Second World War, was flying Hawker Hurricanes with No. 43 Squadron at RAF Tangmere. He was 24 when the war started. On February 3, 1940, months before the Battle of Britain formally began, Townsend was one of 3 pilots from No. 43 Squadron who shot down the first enemy aircraft to crash on English soil in the Second World War. The target was a Heinkel HE-111 from Luftwaffe Unit 4 KG-26, brought down near Whitby, North Yorkshire. His Distinguished Flying Cross was gazetted in April of that year, the citation noting he had displayed qualities of leadership, skill, and determination of the highest order, with little regard for his own safety. He then commanded No. 85 Squadron through the Battle of Britain, flying Hurricanes through the summer of 1940. On August 31st, a cannon shell from a Messerschmitt Bf-110 passed through the glycol tank and exploded in his cockpit. Surgeons amputated his big toe. He returned to operational flying 20 days later. His bar to the DFC came the same week. His Distinguished Service Order followed in May 1941, by which point he had personally destroyed at least 11 enemy aircraft. The official record across his wartime career: 9 aircraft destroyed, 2 shared, 2 probables, 4 damaged, across more than 300 operational sorties. His 11 medal group, DSO, DFC, and BAR, 1939-45 star with Battle of Britain clasp, Commander of the Royal Victorian Order, sold at auction through Dix Noonan Webb in June 2021 for £260,000. The catalogue described them without equivocation as those of a Battle of Britain fighter ace. None of this is the part that brought him into the orbit of the royal family. In February 1944, Townsend was appointed temporary equerry to King George VI, the appointment made permanent later that year. An equerry is an officer attached to the royal household who attends the sovereign at public events and performs close, day-to-day duties in personal service to the monarch. It isn't an administrative posting. Townsend lived in close physical proximity to the royal family for years, traveled with them, attended every significant family occasion, and had daily contact with the king and his daughters. He first met Princess Margaret in February 1944, when she was 13 years old. He later recalled that she struck him as unremarkable, as one would expect of a 14-year-old girl. The relationship that would eventually consume multiple governments didn't begin in her adolescence. That point matters. What the Independent's obituary of Townsend noted, after his death in June 1995, was that by the 1947 South Africa tour, a 3-month trip on which he accompanied the full royal family, he was quite sharp with Princess Margaret, whom he still evidently regarded as little more than a privileged schoolgirl. Something shifted after that, though even then the relationship that developed was gradual. What changed its nature entirely was the death of King George VI on February 6, 1952. Margaret was 21 years old. She turned to Townsend, now serving as controller of the Queen Mother's household at Clarence House, for comfort and support, and he turned to her. His 1978 memoir, Time and Chance, describes their finding solace in one another's company in the aftermath of the king's death. Townsend's own marriage was already effectively over. He had married Cecil Rosemary Pauley on July 17, 1941, and they had 2 sons, Giles and Hugo. The marriage had deteriorated during his prolonged absences in royal service. He filed for divorce in November 1952 on the grounds of his wife's adultery with John de Laszlo, son of the society portrait painter Philip de Laszlo. A decree nisi was granted on December 20, 1952. Townsend was the petitioner, the party the court recognized as being in the right. He proposed to Princess Margaret in April 1953. She accepted. No public engagement was ever announced. The gesture at the coronation on June 2nd forced the timeline of a situation that was already explosive. Margaret had confided in her sister, Queen Elizabeth II, before the public caught wind of it. Townsend's memoir confirms this. The Queen knew. What the British press didn't yet know was that the king's most trusted equerry and the younger princess intended to marry. The Sunday People became the first British newspaper to publish anything about it in June 1953, framing it initially as foreign rumor while signaling unmistakably that there was substance behind the foreign reporting. American and Continental papers had fewer inhibitions. Time magazine would eventually describe the romance as the most controversial royal romance since that of Edward VIII and Wallis Simpson. The palace machinery moved within days of the coronation. Sir Alan Lascelles, the morally rigid courtier who had been King George VI's private secretary and had played a central role in managing the 1936 abdication crisis, was now serving Queen Elizabeth II. When Townsend informed Lascelles of his intention to marry Margaret, Lascelles' response has been quoted widely and verified across multiple biographical accounts. "You must be either mad or bad." Lascelles then consulted Prime Minister Winston Churchill. Churchill's initial personal reaction, on first hearing of the romance, had reportedly been to call it a delightful match. A lovely young royal lady married to a gallant young airman. That sentiment dissolved when constitutional implications were considered. His formal position became that his cabinet and Commonwealth prime ministers couldn't support a marriage not recognized by the Church of England. He also argued that if one royal could easily leave the line of succession, another could easily enter, a principle he considered dangerous for a hereditary monarchy. The shadow of 1936, when his own party had been consumed by the abdication of Edward VIII over a divorced American, was still in the room. Multiple biographical accounts are consistent on what happened next. Lascelles advised both the Queen and Churchill that Townsend needed to be removed from the household immediately. In July 1953, Townsend was removed from the royal household and posted to Brussels as heir attaché at the British Embassy. The posting was arranged so quickly and quietly that the British ambassador, Sir Christopher Warner, reportedly learned of the decision from a newspaper while traveling in the Belgian Congo. Townsend himself described it as a slightly disciplinary measure and believed Churchill was as keen as anyone to get him out of the country and harm's way. He chose Brussels over postings in Singapore and Johannesburg, partly because it kept him physically closer to his sons and within correspondence range of Margaret. In later years, Margaret told Jock Colville, Churchill's former private secretary, that "the 2 men who have ruined my life are Tommy Lascelles and Winston Churchill, who wouldn't let me marry Peter Townsend." The exchange was recorded by historian Kenneth Rose in his diary. Margaret's words aren't the statement of a woman who had arrived freely at a decision. They are the statement of a woman who knew exactly what had been done to her, and by whom. 3 separate forces converged to box her in, and each one operated independently of the others. The Church of England's position on remarriage after divorce was doctrinally unambiguous. From the late 1930s through the 1950s, the Church officially held that remarriage in church of a divorced person with a living former spouse was contrary to the true principle of marriage. A 1938 resolution stated the Church shouldn't allow the use of the marriage service in the case of anyone who has a former partner still living. This position was further formalized in the 1957 Act of Convocation, which declared that remarriage after divorce during the lifetime of a former partner always involves a departure from the principles of true marriage. The crucial nuance, though, one the story requires honesty about, is that the Church's prohibition was specifically on the use of its marriage service. It didn't legally forbid a civil marriage. A divorced person with a living former spouse could legally contract a civil marriage in England. The Church simply wouldn't celebrate it in church. Townsend being the petitioner in his divorce, the party whose wife's adultery was legally established, didn't soften the Church's doctrinal position 1 degree. Any remarriage after divorce while a former spouse lived was the issue, regardless of fault. The Royal Marriages Act 1772 was the second wall. As a descendant of King George II, Margaret required the sovereign's formal consent to marry before the age of 25. Any marriage contracted without that consent was legally null and void. After 25, the constitutional path shifted. A royal whose proposed marriage had been disapproved could give 12 months' notice to the Privy Council and then marry validly, unless both Houses of Parliament formally declared their disapproval. Margaret turned 25 on August 21, 1955. The 2-year waiting period wasn't arbitrary. It was keyed directly to that threshold. The institutional calculation was transparent. Delay until she reached an age where Parliament would be required to take a public position, and trust that time would cool the relationship. Then there was the political dimension. Any alteration to Margaret's succession rights would require changes to succession law that needed Commonwealth agreement. Australia, Canada, New Zealand, and other Commonwealth realms would have had to consent to legislative changes. This wasn't England's decision alone to make. Queen Elizabeth II sat at the intersection of all three pressures: supreme governor of the Church, constitutional monarch bound by ministerial advice, and Margaret's sister. A draft letter Eden prepared for Commonwealth leaders stated that Her Majesty wouldn't wish to stand in the way of her sister's happiness. The Queen wasn't the primary obstacle, but not being the primary obstacle still meant not removing the obstacles. What Margaret believed she would lose matters as much as what she would actually have lost. This is where the historical record produces something more painful than a straightforward story of institutional cruelty. Cabinet papers released by the National Archives in 2004, 50 years after the crisis, revealed that by October 1955, Anthony Eden's government had prepared a compromise plan that the public had never been told about. Under that plan, Margaret could marry Townsend. She would formally renounce her succession rights and those of any children from the marriage. But she would retain her title as Her Royal Highness Princess Margaret, her civil list income, her right to live in the United Kingdom, and her ability to continue performing public duties. The Guardian reported on these documents in January 2004, under the headline, "Secret Deal Would Have Let Princess Keep Royal Title and Income." Margaret was given a categorical assurance that if she married Townsend, she could retain her style, Her Royal Highness Princess Margaret, and her civil list income. Her civil list income was £6,000 per year as a daughter of the sovereign, with an additional £9,000 upon marriage under the Civil List Act 1952, for a combined total of £15,000. Under Eden's plan, she would have kept it. According to Lord Lexden, who wrote about this episode in 2016, Margaret believed that marrying Townsend would ruin her financially, that she would lose her allowance. She was, Lexton argued, bitter afterwards, and had made her decision without full knowledge of the government's concessions. If that is accurate, and the 2004 archival release gives it significant weight, then the sacrifice Margaret made was built partly on a false premise. She gave up the man she loved, believing the cost was everything. The actual cost, under the plan that existed by October 1955, was her succession position, a theoretical claim to a throne she had virtually no chance of ever occupying, given that Prince Charles and Princess Anne were already ahead of her. That isn't to minimize what she chose, or to suggest the decision came easily. The succession renunciation would have been a public, formal, permanent act. It would have required parliamentary legislation and Commonwealth agreement. It would have been announced to the world. The terms of her membership in the institution would have been visibly altered, and the institution could never fully unsignal what that alteration meant. And there was still the church. Even with the civil marriage that was technically available, Andrew Morton described her after her death as a deeply Christian woman who had her own desires that often conflicted with her faith, and she struggled. A civil marriage to a divorced man, celebrated without the blessing of the Church of England, would have been a permanent accommodation with something her faith declined to accept. Her statement would make this explicit. The 2 years between July 1953 and October 1955 weren't quiet years. They were emphatically public ones. Townsend was in Brussels. His official title was Air Attaché at the British Embassy. He maintained his posting, kept his distance, and continued correspondence with Margaret. He had chosen Brussels over Singapore and Johannesburg, partly because it was the closest of the options offered to him, within reach of his sons, within communication distance of a relationship that was being actively sustained. Margaret continued performing royal duties. She attended official functions, completed public engagements, and carried on in the role she had been raised for. On the outside, nothing had visibly changed. Inside Clarence House, she was waiting for a decision the entire British press corps was also waiting for. Popular memory of this period sometimes suggests the British public was unified behind the couple, a kingdom willing them toward happiness against a hard-hearted establishment. The actual record is more divided. A Sunday Express reader survey during the period showed 3/4 of respondents opposed to the marriage. Mass Observation's social research recorded descriptions of Margaret as a silly little fool and worry that she was setting a poor example for young women. The moral climate of mid-1950s Britain wasn't uniformly romantic on the subject of divorce. That division made the press coverage more volatile, not more restrained. Malcolm Muggeridge, writing in the New York Times in October 1955, described the situation as a royal soap opera. By the final weeks of October 1955, dozens of reporters were camped outside Clarence House and outside Townsend's London flat, monitoring every arrival, every departure, every window that lit up. Margaret wrote to Prime Minister Eden that year, explaining she needed to see Townsend when he returned from Brussels on annual leave in October, in order to decide whether she would marry him or not. Her words in that letter conveyed that she needed to see Townsend in person to decide whether I can marry him or not. This is the letter of a woman attempting to make a real decision about her actual life, not performing a role in someone else's drama. On October 27, 1955, she visited Lambeth Palace at her own request for a private audience with Archbishop of Canterbury, Geoffrey Fisher. The meeting lasted approximately 1 hour. What Fisher said to her isn't in the public record. The palace issued a statement that there would be no comment whatsoever. The following day, October 28th, Eden's compromise plan reached final draft form. Margaret could marry Townsend, keep her title, income, and residence, and renounce only her succession rights. Eden was prepared to amend the Royal Marriages Act and to write to Commonwealth leaders explaining the arrangement. Margaret and Townsend had been meeting throughout his leave. They spoke. He later indicated that he believed she would have lost too much by marrying him, not necessarily in the material terms the Eden documents would eventually clarify, but in the life she had been built for and the family she lived inside. On October 31st, 1955, at approximately 7 in the evening, a statement was released from Clarence House and broadcast by the BBC. It was signed simply, Margaret. The statement is 114 words. It must be quoted in full. I would like it to be known that I have decided not to marry Group Captain Peter Townsend. I have been aware that, subject to my renouncing my rights of succession, it might have been possible for me to contract a civil marriage. But mindful of the Church's teachings that Christian marriage is indissoluble, and conscious of my duty to the Commonwealth, I have resolved to put these considerations before others. I have reached this decision entirely alone, and in doing so I have been strengthened by the unfailing support and devotion of Group Captain Townsend. I am deeply grateful for the concern of all those who have constantly prayed for my happiness. Notice what it says and what it doesn't. It does not say she was forbidden. It does not say it was impossible. It explicitly acknowledges that civil marriage was available. Subject to my renouncing my rights of succession, it might have been possible. This is a statement of choice, not constraint. She chose church teaching over a marriage the Church wouldn't bless. She chose duty to the Commonwealth over a private life. She placed those things before others. She says she reached the decision entirely alone. And then, in the same breath, she credits her strength partly to Townsend's unfailing support and devotion. He supported whatever she chose. That detail rarely surfaces in the dramatized versions. Margaret later said she and Townsend had worked on the statement's wording together. No official draft or attribution memo in the public archives confirms or contradicts this. What the National Archives did release in 2004 were drafts prepared by palace and government officials for a different scenario, the announcement that she would marry Townsend. Those drafts included a more personal version, referencing her future happiness, later modified by officials into a more neutral formula. The institution had been writing both outcomes. The institutional response to her compliance was orderly and swift. Archbishop Fisher publicly praised her as a thoroughly good Christian churchwoman. Prime Minister Eden publicly stressed that the government had neither pressed nor advised her to renounce the marriage, distancing his administration from any responsibility for the outcome. The New York Times headline on November 1st read, "Princess decides, marriage barred by duty." Poor Margaret. Isn't she wonderful? That formulation contains almost everything you need to know about what the kingdom offered in exchange: sympathy, admiration, and then the moving on that follows both. Townsend returned to Brussels on November 7th. In 1959, aged 45, he married Marie-Luce Gemagne, a Belgian woman 20 years his junior who bore, by multiple contemporary accounts, a striking resemblance to Princess Margaret. They had 3 children. He died of stomach cancer in Saint-Léger-en-Yvelines, France, on June 19, 1995, aged 80. His independent obituary noted that in later life, he developed a perceptible sense of relief that things turned out the way they did, observing that for men like Anthony Armstrong Jones, Princess Margaret's eventual husband, marrying into the royal family had turned out to be an almost impossible undertaking. He and Margaret met once more, for lunch at Kensington Palace in 1992. They walked together in the garden afterward. What they said to each other was never recorded. What Margaret kept after October 31, 1955, deserves to be stated plainly, because the popular narrative about her sacrifice is often imprecise. She retained her HRH status. She retained her civil list income of £6,000 per year. She retained her residence at Clarence House. She retained her place in the line of succession and her position in the royal household. She renounced nothing because she agreed to nothing. She simply declined, under the terms she understood were on offer, to marry the man she loved. In May 1960, she married Anthony Armstrong Jones, who was created Earl of Snowdon the following year. They had 2 children. They divorced in 1978. Craig Brown's 2017 biography, Ma'am Darling, treats the Townsend decision as the defining event of Margaret's life. Reviews consistently describe Brown as portraying the crisis as more or less forced on her by church and state. The book is a collage, anecdote, irony, contradiction, accumulation, and Brown does not argue, explicitly, that every piece of difficult behavior that followed can be traced causally back to October 31, 1955. Biographies rarely make arguments that clean, because lives rarely work that cleanly. What the biographical record does show, across multiple sources, is this. Margaret's later life was characterized by heavy smoking, significant drinking, complex and often unhappy romantic relationships, and a relationship with the institution she served that was frequently marked by contempt, resentment, and demand. These are documented patterns. Whether they trace causally to October 31, 1955, is an inference, a reasonable one, grounded in sequencing and in what Lord Lexton specifically identified as bitterness arising from a decision made without full information, but an inference. What isn't inference is the sequence itself. The woman this channel has already documented, her behavior toward staff, her entitled demands, her imperious sense of what she was owed, that woman appeared after this. After she did precisely what the family asked of her. After she acted, by any fair measure, with genuine self-sacrifice at real personal cost, under the belief that the cost was greater than it actually was. Eden publicly cleared his government of responsibility. Fisher praised her Christian virtue and moved on. The palace made no formal acknowledgement of the cost to her. The institution accepted her compliance and treated it as the expected outcome. The morning after, the kingdom offered, "Poor Margaret. Isn't she wonderful?" By the afternoon, it had moved on. Margaret didn't move on cleanly. She married a man she initially loved, but with whom the marriage collapsed into misery. She drank. She smoked for most of her adult life. She had a stroke in 1998 and several more in the years that followed. She died on February 9, 2002, at King Edward VII's Hospital in London, aged 71. Reports after her death suggested she carried deep sadness about Townsend into her final years. What the biographical record captures more precisely is Andrew Morton's characterization. A deeply Christian woman who had her own desires that often conflicted with her faith, and she struggled. That word appears in the record because the people around her, across decades, recognized it. She struggled. For 47 years, across 2 marriages and into her death, she carried a decision she made at 24 inside a pressure cooker that multiple governments, one archbishop, a morally rigid courtier, and a prime minister all contributed to building around her. Everything this channel has already told you about Princess Margaret, the behavior we've covered, the demands, the impossible expectations, the cruelty that could be present in her relationships with people who had no power over her, all of it happened after this. After she did the one thing the family asked of her, under terms she only partially understood, and received in return the Archbishop's compliment about her Christian character, and the Prime Minister's public insistence that no one had pressured her at all. She kept her word. The family kept its silence. Maybe that doesn't excuse what came next. That is a fair position, and the people she treated badly were real people whose experiences were real, and her wound does not nullify them. But there is a difference between understanding someone and excusing them. And it's very hard, sitting with this timeline, with these documents, with what we now know was actually offered in October 1955, compared to what Margaret apparently believed was offered, to look at the woman she became and see someone who simply failed at being gracious. What the record more honestly shows is someone who did what was asked, paid what she believed was an enormous price, received almost no acknowledgement of the cost, and spent the next 47 years performing a version of herself that the institution had made necessary. That is where her story actually begins, not in the behavior. Here. In the 14 words at the center of a 114-word statement, broadcast at 7 o'clock on the evening of October 31st, 1955. Mindful of the Church's teachings, conscious of my duty, I have resolved to put these considerations before others. She put them before herself. The question of whether anyone returned the consideration, that one the record leaves open.